Last week, I was having coffee with the senior analyst from a major European investment firm. He spent the first 20 minutes showing me charts of digital service growth, his eyes bright with the conviction that the physical world factories, steel, power grids, was a 20th century relic we'd all outgrown. He called it the era of weightless wealth. To him, the real economy was something you could trade with a thumb swipe, clean and detached from the grime of actual production. But then the conversation shifted to the 2025 year-end data, the PPI rebound and that massive 520 billion yuan surge in infrastructure loans. His reaction was fascinating. He didn't look at the efficiency or the industrial output. He immediately started talking about debt traps and inefficient stimulus. He was dismissive, almost mocking, as if building things was a sign of desperation rather than strength. That was until he tried to show me a video of a new automated port on his phone. The signal dropped. He spent the next 5 minutes cursing the local 5G dead zone and the fact that his building's smart climate control had been broken for a week because the replacement parts were backordered for months. The irony was thick. Here was a man convinced of the supremacy of virtual value. Yet he was visibly frustrated by the crumbling physical reality right under his feet. It made me realize that the 2025 data isn't just a list of economic indicators, it is a physical judgment on two different modes of civilization. While one side of the world has been busy optimizing financial spreadsheets and vetoing every new bridge or power line through endless bureaucracy, the other has been hardening the literal skeleton of the future. This sudden realization that you can't eat a derivative or hide from the rain under a stock option is exactly what the latest figures are screaming at us. We are witnessing the industrial civilization finally performing a high-speed overtake of the financial parasites, and the evidence isn't in a textbook. It's in the physical world we touch every day.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The core question that comes out of that whole interaction is, what happens when this financialized economy needs a physical foundation that it just doesn't prioritize anymore, or maybe doesn't even know how to build?
Yeah. Exactly. It's a civilizational split. You've got one side focused on spreadsheets, on leverage, and the other is focused on steel and tangible capacity.
Right. And for this deep dive, that's what we're looking at. The measurable impact of that divergence. We're going to get into the hard economic data, but also the institutional bottlenecks that really define these two, radically different paths.
And what's so fascinating here is that it's not just a philosophical debate. The data gives you empirical evidence to back up your observation. You can literally measure the outcome of strategic, directed physical investment versus what happens after decades of prioritizing financial optimization, short-term returns.
And all those procedural barriers.
Yes, and all those procedural barriers. We have to look at who is still making things and, crucially, how their approach to industrial growth is just a world away from the models that drove deindustrialization and, frankly, institutional decay in the West.
So let's start there. Let's define that divergence with some concrete numbers. We should really examine the indicators that support this industrial civilization argument, specifically looking at that first half of 2025 data. What does this massive push tell us about the efficiency of a state-led industrial policy versus, a purely market-driven one?
Well, when you look at those H1 2025 figures, the big picture is one of pretty impressive resilience, especially in manufacturing. Despite all the global headwinds, trade tensions, weak demand from developed markets, the economy still recorded robust growth of 5.3% year on year.
And that actually beat their official target, right?
It did. It exceeded the official government target of around 5%. And that underlying stability, it wasn't coming from speculation or soft services. It was underpinned by a physical expansion of manufacturing.
Okay, this is where the paradox really starts, and I think we need to slow down to get this. The engine is running hot, output is strong, but the data also points to this brutal competitive environment, a kind of internal price war. The producer price index, the PPI, kept falling. Can you just quickly clarify what the PPI measures and why its fall is so important here?
Of course. The PPI, the producer price index, is essentially the average change in prices that domestic producers get for their stuff. Think of it as the price tag at the factory gate before it gets to the consumer.
Okay.
So that index fell 3.6% year on year in June, and that was the 33rd straight monthly decline. This long-term weakness in factory gate prices means one thing: deflationary pressure and just severe competition. For corporations, it absolutely hammered their profitability. Industrial profits fell dramatically by 18% in the first half of the year.
18%, but revenues were still up.
Revenues managed to rise, by about 2.5%.
So, okay, this is the conflict. You have two numbers pulling in opposite directions. Profits are down 18%, which would be a total crisis in a financialized system. But at the same time, the underlying industrial output grew strongly by 6.4%. How is that sustainable? I mean, in a typical Western model focused on shareholder returns, an 18% profit drop would mean massive layoffs, shutting down factories, capital just fleeing. What's the mechanism that lets output surge when margins are getting crushed like that?
This is the absolute crux of the state-led industrial model. The mechanism prioritizes market share, physical scale, and building capacity in strategic sectors over, short-term financial health or immediate profit.
So the goal isn't this quarter's earnings per share.
Not at all. When the government, usually through state-directed banks, strategically pushes out new loans, we saw a massive 12.74 trillion RMB in new loans in H1 2025, it's signaling a tolerance for risk, a tolerance for lower immediate returns in exchange for future global dominance.
So the manufacturers are incentivized to just keep going.
Exactly. They keep producing even if they're selling at razor-thin margins or even negative margins, because they're getting that credit support. And they're focused on out-competing and maybe even consolidating their smaller, weaker domestic rivals.
So the manufacturers are still building, still investing, driven by something other than just immediate profit. And that leads us to what they're actually making. It's not just generic stuff. It's a very clear, directed focus on the future.
Precisely. Manufacturing output specifically rose by 7.0%, which really affirms its role as the key economic driver. But if you look closer at where that growth is, it's not uniform. It was particularly strong in high-tech manufacturing, which expanded by 9.5%. And in equipment-related industries, which were up 10.2%.
So those are segments that are just massively outpacing the rest of the industrial sector.
By a huge margin.
So if we're looking for the physical proof, the tangible things that show this strategic shift, what are the specific output surges that really stand out?
This is the evidence that the financial analyst in your story was missing. We're talking about huge increases in the physical production of strategic next-generation goods. For example, the output of 3D printing equipment. It surged by an astounding 43.1%.
43%?
Yeah. Production of new energy vehicles, or NEVs, which is a major global competitive frontier, that jumped by 36.2%. And maybe the most telling number for the future of their factories, the output of industrial robots soared by 35.6%.
So they're not just making products, they're making the tools to make better, faster products in the future.
That is exactly it. The narrative of high-speed change is absolutely undeniable in those figures. And this directed industrial upgrade, it's not just for domestic use. It's fundamentally changing the whole global trading structure.
Right, because their exports are still growing.
They're restructuring global trade entirely. The overall resilience in exports of 5.9% year-on-year in the first half of 2025 was achieved even with some major headwinds. Specifically, there was a sharp 16.1% decline in shipments to the U.S. in June.
So how did they offset that?
Through an aggressive diversification strategy. They got strong growth in exports to new markets, places like ASEAN, which was up 13%, Africa up 21.6%, and Latin America up 7.2%.
So it suggests that if the established Western markets are slowing down or putting up trade barriers, the industrial output just pivots and builds markets elsewhere. And those places are often hungry for infrastructure and advanced physical goods.
That's the strategic playbook. And the stuff they're exporting is moving up the value chain. The so-called new three product categories, that's EVs, lithium batteries, and solar cells, those expanded by 12.7%. High-end equipment exports grew over 20%.
And the overall mix is changing.
If you look at the macro structure, electromechanical products, so things like machinery, electric apparatus, sophisticated components, they now account for a massive 60% of total exports. It's a clear shift. They're exporting high-value physical goods to manufacturing and development hubs abroad, and in doing so, they're effectively moving their own position up the global value chain.
Which brings us back to the capital. The money needed to sustain this. My analyst friend called it inefficient stimulus. But what are the specific metrics that show the flow of capital is strategic, that it's going into hardening this physical skeleton and not just, financial speculation?
The direction of investment is undeniable. As I mentioned, new RMB loans were 12.74 trillion in H1 2025. And crucially, that capital wasn't primarily speculative. It flowed explicitly towards physical production and infrastructure. We saw infrastructure lending surge by 2.18 trillion RMB.
So that's capital going directly into building roads, rail, ports, power grid.
The literal physical foundation of the economy, yes.
And what about into the factories themselves? Are we seeing similar commitments to building new capacity or upgrading old plants?
Absolutely. Medium and long-term loans that were directed specifically to manufacturing, they increased by 920.7 billion RMB. And you see this reflected in the targeted fixed asset investment, or FAI.
Right, because overall FAI was slowing down.
It was, yeah, but that was because it was being dragged down by the contracting real estate sector, which shrank by over 11%. But if you exclude real estate, investment actually rose by 6.6%. And that growth was driven almost entirely by infrastructure and manufacturing.
Are there any specific sectors that stand out?
Definitely. Specific strategic investment surges include the auto sector, which jumped by 22.2%, and rail, ship, and aerospace manufacturing investment, which increased robustly by 27.3%.
It really looks like a system that is actively creating the future at once, instead of just waiting for market signals. The equipment renewal policy seems like a perfect example of this proactive, state-directed approach.
It is entirely proactive. Equipment manufacturing stayed strong, with its Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI, at 51.4, and that was supported directly by the government's large-scale equipment renewal stimulus policy. This policy action, it signals a clear priority.
So they're also trying to boost consumption at the same time, right?
They are. They're trying to shift the economy toward consumption-led growth.
Yeah.
We saw the government roll out a 30-point plan for that, things like trade-in programs for appliances and loan subsidies for catering and healthcare.
So it's a dual strategy. You try to encourage consumption, which is always going to be volatile, while at the same time you make sure the physical industrial base, the core structural strength, is non-negotiable and keeps growing no matter what the short-term consumer mood is.
That's exactly right. They're dealing with a structural problem that household consumption is only about 40% of their GDP, which is way below the typical 60+% you see in developed economies. But until that domestic demand fully stabilizes, the physical industrial base provides this unmatched resilience.
And the export numbers prove the intentionality.
Right. The focus on high-tech exports, like that 12.7% growth in the new three, it shows it's all part of a plan. The PPI decline just highlights how fierce the competition is, but the output growth proves the strategy's working. They're building crucial physical scale, even if it means tolerating massive corporate margin compression.
Okay, so we've seen a powerful mechanism for building and scaling and doing it rapidly. Now, let's pivot to the institutional friction that defines the other mode of civilization. If one side is proactively removing constraints to build, 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, the other side seems to be struggling to fund and finish basic maintenance, let alone massive new projects. This is where the concept of veto-cracy comes in.
This is the institutional explanation for why infrastructure projects in the West often take decades and cost multiples of the global norm. We should define veto-cracy clearly. It's a dysfunctional system of governance where no single entity can get enough power to make effective, timely decisions.
Because everyone has a veto.
Exactly. Because of an excessive ability or willingness across all these different political bodies and stakeholders to use their veto power. It really points to a deep lack of centralized trust, a fragmentation of power.
And in systems like the US, these veto points, they're not just checks and balances anymore. They're systemic tripwires that opposition groups can exploit almost without limit.
They are layered deep into the political and legal processes. I mean, just think of the journey a bill or a major infrastructure plan has to take. Veto points exist with individual representatives, House and Senate committee chairs, the Senate filibuster, the Supreme Court, and then you have powerful lobbyists,
right,
whose spending capacity in Washington is estimated to be 4 times greater than all other lobbying combined. The sheer number of people who have to agree just dramatically reduces the success rate of federal legislation. It's dropped from about 7% historically to just 2% in the modern era.
And the result of that political paralysis is frustration, which just feeds into all the instability we're seeing globally. Populism calls for strongmen, political polarization.
Precisely. When citizens feel that the government is incapable of solving obvious physical problems like updating an electrical grid or repairing a bridge, they lose faith in the system itself. And this veto-cracy isn't just a federal issue.
It's at the local level, too.
It's at the local level, too. Right. Subnational veto-cracy at state and local levels is cited as a major reason for the astronomical costs of infrastructure and housing in places like California and New York. Local opposition, often under the NBY banner, not in my backyard, weaponizes zoning interview processes.
So let's get to that physical judgment, the crippling costs. Why is the U.S. infrastructure delivery system seen as such a global anomaly in its inefficiency?
The statistics are. They're truly sobering. While mega-project costs have gone up everywhere, the U.S. stands virtually alone among large, industrialized economies in its inability to deliver projects on time and on budget. Take heavy rail development. Building just 1 kilometer of heavy rail in the U.S. costs twice as much as in Germany and an astonishing 3 times as much as in Sweden and Japan.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge that number. 3 times more than Japan. Japan is known for extremely dense, complex engineering, a lot of expensive tunneling. Is the U.S. using complex tunneling that would account for that huge cost difference?
That's a fair challenge, but the data holds up. The U.S. has among the highest rail development costs globally, despite having a lower proportion of the most expensive part, which is tunneled track. The cost inflation is due to process, not complexity.
It's not the engineering, it's bureaucracy.
It's the layers of regulatory review, litigation, community demands, and inflated labor costs that drive up the price, not inherently more difficult engineering.
Give us the famous horror stories of delay that make this real.
The LA to San Francisco high-speed rail project is the definitive example of institutional failure. It was originally projected to cost $33 billion and be finished by 2020.
Okay.
The current expectation is a projected cost of $100 billion, a tripling with completion pushed back to 2033. Just think about the economic opportunity cost of those 13 years of delay and the $67 billion in cost overruns. And this isn't an isolated case. Highway development projects also saw average timelines balloon from 2.2 years in the 1970s to 6.6 years by 2011.
And the procedural weapon that opposition groups use to create these delays is often the environmental review process, specifically by leveraging the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA.
NEPA, enacted in 1970, is a procedural framework. It's often called the Magna Carta of environmental law. But because it relies on litigation to resolve policy disputes, it fosters what we call adversarial legalism. It essentially creates this massive collection of veto points that opposition groups, whether they're environmentalists, local residents, or even business rivals, can easily exploit.
How does that adversarial legalism work in practice? How do they use vague language to stall a project that might be essential?
The language is often intentionally vague. So litigants challenge agency decisions on procedural grounds. They'll argue that the agency failed to properly identify a significant environmental impact or didn't rigorously assess an alternative project.
Yeah.
The scope for these challenges is massive.
So even the agencies don't know what full compliance looks like.
Just exactly. Even after decades of court rulings, agencies are still uncertain about what full NEPA compliance looks like, which means nearly any controversial project is vulnerable to a lawsuit of, middling quality. Opposition groups file these lawsuits not necessarily to win on the merits, but to gain leverage, drain the project's political will, and cause massive delays.
So the system creates a vicious cycle where time is the ultimate cost multiplier.
That's it. Every delay means more billable hours for consultants, extended rental periods for heavy equipment, increased material storage costs. These factors invariably raise the cost, which in turn galvanizes more opposition, reduces political support, and leads to further delays. It's a self-reinforcing negative feedback loop that often kills projects entirely.
And beyond the legal procedure, we also see this decline of state capacity in actually getting things done, which is highlighted by that New York City labor paradox. This isn't just about environmental rules, it's about control over execution.
That specific New York City anecdote about construction labor is incredibly revealing. Construction firms and union leaders there, they negotiate staffing and wage decisions without government involvement, even when the state is the client paying for the project. The result is projects having 4 times the number of construction staff compared to similar European projects.
4 times the staff.
4 times. And while it's often defended on safety grounds, official injury rates are not significantly lower than in other major developed cities. This just dramatically inflates blue-collar labor costs and construction timelines.
So a lack of robust state capacity, the government's ability to coordinate, control, and execute effectively, it allows private interests and these adversarial procedures to basically dictate costs and timelines.
That's the core vulnerability. Development projects in the U.S. are uniquely reliant on individual elected officials, public sector champions, to champion the cause, gather resources, and manage all the inevitable conflicts. This makes the entire project vulnerable to political turnover, changing attitudes, or the incentive for officials to seek political pork in exchange for their support.
This is power that should be held by civil servants.
It's power reserved for politicians that is typically held by expert, long-term civil servants in more functional, centralized systems.
But the capacity for speed and efficiency does exist in the U.S. It's just buried. The I-95 bridge repair in Philadelphia in 2023 is the perfect contrast. It shows what happens when that institutional friction is deliberately removed.
The I-95 repair is the proof. When that bridge collapsed, Governor Shapiro leveraged emergency powers. And this wasn't just a political announcement. It was a mechanism to bypass most of the normal procedural constraints. NEPA reviews, local zoning approvals, lengthy procurement processes, even standard union negotiation periods.
And the result?
A project that would typically take many months under normal circumstances, mired in lawsuits and permitting, was completed in just 11 days.
That one action proved that the 3-decade-long timeline for the LA high-speed rail is not an issue of geology or engineering difficulty. It's an issue of institutional failure.
Absolutely. The centralized state capacity we saw leveraged briefly during the I-95 emergency, which delivers results by minimizing procedural risk. That's the default setting in the competing system we discussed earlier, the one that built 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail since 2008. The default setting in the veto-cracy model, however, ensures essential large-scale links remain undone, leading to massive long-term economic and logistical deficits. It's the difference between a hardened, resilient skeleton and one that is corroding under its own weight.
This shift toward weightless wealth clearly has physical consequences for infrastructure. But the physical world requires physical expertise engineers, material scientists, skilled technicians. So what does this economic divergence mean for the necessary engineering and technical talent in the West?
The data on talent acquisition and development, it shows a profound asymmetry. And it really exposes the fragility of the Western model. Historically, the U.S. has maintained a technical edge by, well, riding on the coattails of its unique appeal to the world's best and brightest. But that advantage is rapidly diminishing under the sheer scale and strategic planning of competitors.
So let's look at the sheer quantitative scale of the competing model first. What are the measurable results of decades of strategic investment in STEM talent development through programs like Project 985 and Project 211?
The quantitative advantage is staggering, especially at the advanced degree level. By 2025, China is projected to nearly double the annual U.S. STEM PhD output. They'll graduate 77,000 PhDs per year versus 40,000 in the U.S.
Double the output.
And if you exclude international students studying in the U.S., if you only count domestic U.S. students, China more than triples that figure. It's 77,000 versus 23,000.
And the pipeline for future engineers and scientists, that's also massive.
Correct. The scale advantage starts much earlier. In 2019, China graduated over 4 times as many STEM bachelor students. That's 1.8 million versus 445,000, and nearly doubled the number of master's graduates.
So while the U.S. benefits from international students, China is building this unparalleled domestic capacity.
Right. International students make up nearly half of the master's pool in the U.S., which is a huge benefit. But the domestic scaling in China is on another level.
And crucially, the quality is rapidly improving. It's challenging the traditional Western lead in high-end research.
Quality is accelerating. In 2020, 71 Chinese universities ranked in the top 500 globally. That's a massive leap from just 23 a decade earlier.
Yeah.
And even if you limit the comparison to only those top-ranked institutions, the globally competitive ones, China still outproduces the U.S. in STEM PhDs.
So their leadership sees this as fundamental.
Their leaders call talent the first resource. They see it as the essence of innovation, and they directly link educational output to physical production capacity.
Okay, so the U.S. is losing the volume game. Its remaining asymmetric advantage is its ability to attract and retain international talent. How precarious is that advantage?
It is the single most valuable remaining advantage. Surveys show that around 60% of advanced STEM talent based abroad would consider moving to the U.S., compared to only 10% for China. Historically, the U.S. has been a magnet. Nearly 90% of Chinese STEM PhD students have stayed in the U.S. for at least 10 years after graduation. That's a massive self-replenishing source of expertise.
But the U.S. immigration system seems institutionally engineered to squander that advantage through just pure bureaucratic inefficiency. The visa and green card backlogs are essentially acting as self-imposed veto points against talent acquisition.
That's a powerful way to frame it. The policy impedance is a form of self-vetocracy. Numerical caps on employment-based green cards haven't materially changed in decades. The result: the employment-based green card backlog exceeded 1.2 million individuals in 2020.
And the wait times are just absurd.
The sheer absurdity of the policy is illustrated by the fact that an Indian STEM PhD holder who gets a U.S. job offer today faces a projected wait time of 84 years before their green card application is issued.
84 years. You cannot ask a world-class AI researcher or a nuclear engineer to plan their life around an 84-year wait. What is the tangible loss we are incurring because of this policy failure?
The loss is high-skilled, trained talent. Visa issues have contributed to a decline in international STEM enrollments. More critically, for international AI PhDs who chose to leave the U.S. after graduating, over half of them explicitly cited immigration issues, visa uncertainty, difficulty getting permanent residency in their decision. The U.S. taxpayers subsidize their world-class education only for policy to force them to take that expertise somewhere else.
And while the U.S. is forcing this talent out, competitors are actively poaching it.
Other nations are aggressively exploiting this policy gap. Canada, for instance, runs organized campaigns targeting U.S.-based STEM talent, using slogans like H-1B problems, pivot to Canada. This is leading to a measurable brain drain. Between 2017 and 2019, immigration data suggests the U.S. lost over 20,000 highly skilled workers to Canada alone.
So they're reforming their systems to attract talent while the U.S. remains shackled.
They are directly linking talent acquisition with national economic strategy, while the U.S. is stuck with outdated quotas.
Okay, now let's pivot from that high-end talent to the domestic workforce, the people who actually perform physical manufacturing. The decline of engineering capacity seems to be paralleled by the decline in the value of the manufacturing job itself, and that's driven by this shift towards shareholder capitalism.
This is a crucial social and economic cost. The financialization of the economy accelerated dramatically in the early 1970s, which established the dominance of shareholder capitalism. Under this model, the primary, sometimes the sole responsibility of a company is to maximize returns for its owners.
And that often means abandoning any responsibility to employees, the community, or the environment.
Right. And it drove a global race to the bottom on labor costs.
The consequence is that today's domestic manufacturing jobs often pay less than nearby service or retail jobs. It's completely dismantled the historic foundation of the middle class.
Exactly. The manufacturing jobs that do remain domestically are often hollowed out. You hear frequent anecdotes of line workers at auto parts plants making barely more than minimum wage. Aluminum manufacturers, after a decade of service, might only be earning $19 an hour. In many regions, that's significantly less than what local fast food or retail managers are making, despite the physical intensity and the specialized nature of the factory work.
This disconnect between the immense value of the product being made and the meager wage paid to the domestic worker. It's perfectly captured by that markup problem anecdote. We should use that to explain how financialization works on a micro level.
That anecdote is a powerful illustration of how labor value has been decoupled from profit. You take the socks example. An anecdote details socks being sourced from overseas for about 90 cents a pair, which were then sold domestically for close to $20 a pair.
A staggering 22x markup.
Right. And while you have overhead, freight, marketing costs, sure. But the massive profit margins clearly do not trickle down to the workers in the domestic supply chain or even those involved in final processing or distribution.
And the mindset of the management seems to reflect this financialized priority. When labor problems come up, owners complain about shortages, but their solutions are trivial, like a pizza party instead of competitive wages.
The mindset, as reported in various analyses of these regions, views workers as worthless, uneducated meat machines. That, quote, reported as a description of the prevailing ownership attitude, it just demonstrates a fundamental abandonment of the social contract. The emphasis is entirely on optimizing the financial spreadsheet, not on investing in human capital or community stability.
So this raises a really important question. How can a nation hope to revitalize its industrial base and prioritize physical production and high-quality engineering when its own institutional structure and shareholder incentives actively devalue the people who do the physical work?
It's a jarring parallel. The data shows China explicitly prioritizing talent and industrial capacity, investing heavily in STEM output to build what they call the first resource, while the U.S. actively compromises its technical edge through self-imposed policy barriers like that 84-year green card wait. The consequence is a highly productive manufacturing sector, still the world's number 2, but it's one that has shed its social responsibility and that has led to social decline and anger in deindustrialized regions.
We're seeing a cycle of decline here. Businesses chasing maximum profit drove jobs overseas, which resulted in an ocean of cheap goods, which consumers then became utterly accustomed to. Now, the necessary step of bringing those jobs back runs straight into this hard wall of consumer price expectations.
This is the paradox of cheap goods. It's a deep political and economic trap, and it really defines the Western dilemma. For decades, the system relied on low wages abroad to produce inexpensive products. The reality is that across the broad economy, consumers prioritize cheap goods over paying a premium for goods that support a living wage domestically.
And crucially, the low wages earned by the working poor and middle class here at home forces them to rely on that cheapness for survival. It's an endless feedback loop.
It's a self-reinforcing dependency, and it benefits the financial class at the expense of the working class. Many middle-class people no longer grasp the concept of quality or durability because cheap, disposable items, like that $5 hammer you mentioned, are the norm.
Right.
And for poor Americans, cheap overseas products are absolutely essential for necessities like clothing, basic furniture, toiletries, bringing these jobs back and raising prices significantly. Some estimates suggest a 30% increase for many items, potentially turning a $10 shirt into a $90 shirt. That would impose genuine humanitarian and economic hardship on millions still in poverty.
So if we can't bring back the old low-skill, high-wage jobs because of cost expectations, and we can't afford to raise prices that dramatically, does the future of domestic manufacturing in the West just depend entirely on automation?
It largely does, and we have to be clear about why the jobs were lost in the first place. While the trade deficit with countries like China is linked to the loss of 3.7 million manufacturing jobs since the late 90s, automation is also a primary culprit.
Right, because manufacturing output in the U.S. hasn't actually declined.
It hasn't. It remains the world's second largest. It's manufacturing employment that has collapsed.
So the return of domestic manufacturing won't look like the 1950s factory floor. It's going to be lights-out operations, factories run mostly by robots?
Absolutely. For domestic manufacturing to make economic sense in a high-wage country, it often requires extensive automation, removing most of the human element. Automation reduces shipping costs, it decreases delivery times, and it increases product quality. That makes proximity to the customer, a domestic location, economically viable again.
But the jobs that are left are highly skilled.
Exactly. The jobs that remain are for robotics, electronics, maintenance, software integration, not the low-skill assembly line work of the past. And unfortunately, the U.S. lacks the comprehensive vocational training and apprenticeship systems that are needed to fill those new high-skill roles at scale.
And this creates a severe social problem. If manufacturing returns primarily through automated factories, we're just replacing low-wage foreign workers without creating many new domestic opportunities for the low-skill population.
That exacerbates the hollowing out of the middle class. It intensifies this bimodal wage structure, high-skilled coders and low-skilled service workers. And this lack of livable, reliable jobs is consistently cited as a major driver of the social dysfunction, polarization, and political upheaval we're seeing in deindustrialized regions globally.
Which is why some analysts bring up interventions like universal basic income or UBI.
Right, to address the inevitable automation-driven job displacement.
But UBI has its own major political and economic critiques. You mentioned the potential problem of landlords just adjusting rent. Can you elaborate on that critique?
The critique is centered on subsidy capture. Opponents of UBI argue that simply handing out cash may not lift people out of poverty if the supply of essential goods, like housing, is inelastic. A key example is how property owners in areas with rental assistance programs, like the Section 8 voucher limits in the U.S., often adjust rents upward to capture the full value of the subsidy.
So critics worry a national UBI would just be captured by landlords.
They worry it would be captured by landlords and real estate owners, leading primarily to housing cost inflation rather than genuine economic security for the people receiving it.
So let's turn to policy options for reindustrialization. The German contrast offers some valuable insight into how a country can automate without completely destroying its industrial base.
Germany provides a necessary roadmap. Between 2000 and 2010, the U.S. lost around 33% of its manufacturing jobs. Germany lost only 11%. Germany successfully maintained a trade surplus. It specialized in high-end, complex machinery and machine parts. This trade surplus allowed workers displaced from lower-end sectors, like textiles or consumer goods, to transition into higher-value machine manufacturing jobs. And they were often aided by robust, state-supported apprenticeship programs that the U.S. had neglected. They built capacity and focused on exports, while the U.S. prioritized cheap imports and financial services.
And the U.S. is now finally starting to pivot back to a strategic industrial policy with massive initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHPS Act. This is an explicit rejection of that hands-off globalization model.
It is an explicit and I would say necessary course correction. These acts are designed to shore up industrial capacity by investing hundreds of billions in key future technologies, semiconductors, batteries, clean energy, and we're seeing major visible results. The $20 billion Intel semiconductor complex in Ohio, the $100 billion Micron facility in New York, and critical battery facilities like Ascend Elements in Kentucky.
So reshoring is real.
The reshoring movement is tangible. Yeah, the U.S. is on pace to bring back hundreds of thousands of jobs from overseas in recent years.
However, these high-tech sectors still need access to strategic materials. And that creates a vulnerability that has to be addressed if the U.S. wants genuine industrial resilience. Otherwise, we're just trading one form of dependence for another.
That dependency remains critical. The U.S. is dependent on adversaries for essential raw materials and processing capacity. For instance, China currently has 76% of the world's lithium battery capacity and 60% of rare earth metals, which are vital for everything from EVs to wind turbines.
And it goes beyond just commercial products.
It's a national security issue. Even more concerning are materials required for defense, like antimony, which is critical for night vision goggles and nuclear weapon triggers. The U.S. needs a robust plan to acquire materials like lithium, cobalt, and graphite, and significantly boost the national defense stockpile, which has been critically underfunded. It's fallen from an inflation-adjusted high of $42 billion in 1952 to just $888 million in 2021.
So beyond domestic subsidies and investment, what about leveraging international trade and currency policy to force a global rebalancing?
Trade and currency actions are seen as a vital third leg of the stool. Policymakers should consider setting annual targets for reducing the trade deficit with key industrial rivals. A major focus has to be on neutralizing currency manipulation, using targeted pressure similar to the 1985 Plaza Accord.
What was the Plaza Accord, and why is it a relevant precedent here?
The Plaza Accord was a landmark agreement signed in 1985 between the U.S., Japan, West Germany, France, and the U.K. The U.S. was suffering from a massive trade deficit, and it successfully forced Japan and Germany to appreciate their currencies against the U.S. dollar. This made their exports more expensive and U.S. exports cheaper, which helped rebalance trade.
So a similar modern approach might use targeted tariffs as leverage.
Exactly, to force cooperation on currency valuation and trade imbalances.
And finally, the U.S. just needs to become a better global seller of its products, competing head-to-head with state-subsidized exports.
Absolutely. The U.S. must revitalize institutions like the Export-Import Bank, which subsidizes U.S. exports, especially in key areas like clean energy tech, to compete with subsidized exports from other industrial powers. This strategy isn't about isolation. It's about adopting a rooted globalization that prioritizes domestic production, invests in a national talent pipeline, and rebalances trade dynamics. And that provides a necessary stability that can mitigate the geopolitical tensions fueled by deep economic insecurity.
This whole debate illustrates that the industrial civilization in the West isn't dead, but has been systematically starved by incentives that favor the financial ledger over physical reality, a destructive legacy of pure shareholder capitalism.
And you see the heavy geopolitical consequences. Dependence on adversaries for essential materials like antimony for our defense supply chains, and 30% of the global auto supply chain, a hollowed-out middle class, and severe social decline, with issues like the opioid crisis often cited as a direct consequence of job loss and community collapse in the industrial heartlands. The data suggests that for the U.S. to revitalize, it must maintain and accelerate this current shift toward strategic industrial policy. It's an explicit, necessary rejection of the unfettered globalization model that has failed to stabilize democracies and instead fostered immense polarization globally.
We started with the observation that the physical world is delivering a judgment on the weightless economy, and we've seen that judgment play out. It's in the form of robust high-tech manufacturing growth and strategic infrastructure spending on one side, with massive surges in NEV and robot production, supported by trillions in targeted lending, even with crashing profits.
And on the other side, we've cataloged the consequence of institutional friction-crippling bureaucratic delays, astronomical infrastructure costs, like heavy rail costing 3 times more than in Japan,
and a technical talent advantage that is actively being jeopardized by policy barriers that lead to things like an 84-year green card backlog.
If you consider the geopolitical and civilizational impact, we're examining two fundamentally different approaches to achieving prosperity and resilience. One seeks stability by hardening its industrial base, by actively directing resources toward the physical production of the future robots, NEVs, advanced materials, regardless of short-term financial volatility.
While the other, operating under the institutional shadow of veto-cracy and financial optimization, leaves its essential physical systems vulnerable.
Right. It relies heavily on an increasingly insecure, immigration-dependent talent pipeline, and it faces the structural dilemma of cheap goods addiction. The enduring truth is clear. Human civilization, regardless of its ever-advancing digital layer, ultimately rests on steel, concrete, and the expertise of those who dedicate their lives to building and maintaining them.